I'm delighted and honored to introduce the keynotes, one of our keynote speakers for the 6th Diversity and Inclusion Conference of the Webster University. My name is Julian Schuster, and I serve as a president of this university. And you know, a really great honor to introduce Charlotte Clymer, and as our keynote speaker. In our little conversation before we enter into the main event for this evening, Charlotte and I talked a little bit, and she insisted that it is her desire that we do not have a formal presentation, but rather that we talk and that we engage each other in this conversation. Thus, whatever I read about Charlotte today, I will not do her a favor, because she had accomplished more than these several sentences that I will share with you. And the only way that we can get a truly grasp about the breadth and depth of her experiences, her thoughts, and the message that she has to share with us tonight, this evening, would be if we have an opportunity not only to listen to her, but to engage her. So without any further ado, allow me to read a few things about Charlotte, and then to ask her to tell us a little bit more about her perspective on this very important issue for not only for our conference, but for our society. Because that issue is at the vortex, if you wish, at the fulcrum of diversity, equity, and inclusion. However we slice and dice this DEI, the topic that our keynote speaker will address this evening is in it, and it is a very important part of it. It is part of our past. Some of us might not be aware of that. It is part of our everyday life today, in our present, and it certainly will require all of us to chart the path to the future in addressing this and similar issues. So, Charlotte Clymer currently serves as the Communication Director for Catholics for Choice. She is the former press secretary for Rapid Response at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest civil rights organization dedicated to advancing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer equality. She also serves on the DC Commission for Persons with Disabilities, the board for the Center for Law and Military Policy, the Military and Veterans Advisory Council for OUTSER, Service Members Legal Defense Network, and the Advisory Council for Running Start and the Lone Star Parity Project, organizations working toward gender parity in elected office. Her commentary has been quoted by the New York Times, Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Guardian, Time, Newsweek, and numerous other publications. Her work has been published in Washington Post, NBC News, GQ, The Independent, Quartz, Dame Magazine, and many, many, many other outlets. She is 2019 40 Under 40 Queer Woman of DC, honorary and graduate of Georgetown University, and one of Fortune magazine's 40 Under 40 in 2020. She insisted that I mention that she is a Texan, military veteran, and proud transgender woman, currently based in beautiful Washington, DC. So without any further ado, Charlotte, may I pass the baton to you, and let us learn together.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, President Schuster. That was quite lovely. Prior to our introduction to all of this, President Schuster and I were talking about chess programs in the country, because I grew up playing chess. I'm a huge chess nerd. And Webster University, and part of why I'm tickled to speak here tonight, is Webster University is one of the top chess collegiate programs in the country. Y'all have won the National Chess Championship 6 or 7 times at this point, just completely dominating the world of competitive collegiate chess. So there's a little chess nerd heart in me that's so delighted to be speaking to you tonight. My name is Charlotte Clymer. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a proud transgender woman. I'm also a very proud Texan. I'm a proud military veteran. And, most of all, I am really just a human being trying to navigate through this world, just like everyone else, and just like those of you watching. I consider it a great honor to be invited to speak here tonight because, we're in the middle of a week-long conference featuring some of the most influential, hardworking, and compassionate voices in the country to share a program with Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, someone who I very much consider a modern day prophet in social equality, is profoundly moving. She will be giving the keynote address tomorrow evening, I believe at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, but I will be attending that. And I encourage everyone watching to also tune in to listen to Patrisse Cullors talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. I want to thank the organizers of this conference. I know we had some technical difficulties a few minutes ago, but I cannot tell you how much effort was put into this conference. Vincent Flewellen, Corinne Hilbert, President Schuster, of course, and really the entire staff of Webster University has been phenomenal in bringing this together, making sure everything ran smoothly, and how ironic with all that preparation that we have something like a small technical difficulty happen. That's the drawback of these. We get to watch this from the comfort of our own homes, and yet at the same time, it's virtual. And so there are always going to be hiccups. And so I really want to thank Webster for putting so much effort and labor into this. This conference, like every diversity, equity, and inclusion effort, DEI, is meant to be a compass. It can point us in the right direction, but we still have to read the map in our hands. We have to find our place on it. We have to pinpoint where we are and where we need to be, and then do the work of walking to that point. That is not so easy. When I joined the Army and went through basic training, we learned land navigation. Literally, you're given a map and a compass, and you're told to find points on the map, and it's really hard. It's incredibly hard. There are classes that teach it. You have to learn how to really chart your path on the map, read different contour lines, all sorts of stuff. And no one told me that having a compass is really only part of the challenge. Watching movies when I grew up, I thought if you had a compass, then you were halfway home, and that's not the case. But when we started learning, I found out, much to my surprise, that a compass can only do so much for you, because there are forests and swamps and hills and cliffs to move around or climb over or traverse with anxiety. There's the rain and the snow and the heat, and it frazzles and vexes you along the way. Soldiers have quite literally died doing land navigation during training. So many more have either passed out from dehydration or gotten hopelessly lost in the wilderness, alone and hungry and desperate to find their way back to community and safety. And all of them had a compass. All of them. They were given a compass. And they were trained how to use it, and yet they still got lost. So there is an important difference between having the tools to do the work and actually applying them to do the work. I say all this because some of you may be attending your first ever DEI conference. Some of you may not know where to begin when it comes to the concept of diversity, when it comes to understanding equity and inclusion. And the last thing I want you to think is that everyone else here knows exactly what they're doing and that you're somehow the odd person out, because that's just not the case. We're all learning. This is an ongoing process. There is no one in the world, no one, who knows everything there is to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's an ongoing education. It's about connecting with our fellow human beings. And it takes a lifetime to learn. And so if you feel uncomfortable coming to this conference, I would say that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. When it comes to conversations like these, trust me when I say that discomfort is a gift. It's a signal that there's something on this map in your hands that doesn't make sense yet. The contours and the grid lines are unfamiliar and they're begging to be understood. So this sense of discomfort is an opportunity. It's a chance to be a more empathetic human being, to understand yourself more fully, and of course, to be a better leader. But most importantly, it's that empathy part of the equation that requires your attention. And that's why we're here. That's why we're gathered. Whatever you may do in this life, understanding the struggles of others will always serve you well. I don't care what it is. Every job, every industry, every family, every friendship, you are more equipped to handle the challenges of this life by exploring the art of empathy. And it's hard, and it's supposed to be hard, because human beings are complex. And the more we get to learn more about our fellow human beings, the more we realize we don't know. And the more we require conversations like this to get to a point where we start understanding each other. So I don't want any of you attending this conference to feel alone or inadequate, or like you have, too much privilege, or you should be ashamed of who you are because of the privileges you might hold. I don't want any of you to feel like you're not welcome here. The fact that you're taking the time to pick up the compass and to pick up the map and to walk with us on this journey is a sign that you're exactly where you need to be. So before I continue and tell you more about my personal story, I have a few disclaimers, and they're very important. The first is that I can only speak to my own experience. I am not a spokeswoman for the trans non-binary community. I am one trans woman, one trans person on my own particular journey. And I am no more qualified to speak for other trans non-binary people than they are to speak for me. No community is a monolith. No community is exactly the same. Not trans non-binary people, not women, not people of color, not disabled people, not religious minorities. No community is a monolith. You will never find a community where everyone has the same experiences and everyone thinks the same way. That doesn't exist. Every community has disagreements. They have different worldviews. They have different approaches, different ways of engaging the obstacles before us. Now, that sounds like common sense, and yet you would be surprised. Part of the challenge of being an activist these days, especially for trans non-binary people, is that there is a lack of information on trans identities in popular culture. We do have trans non-binary celebrities, folks who are known to the wider public, but that's all the public sees. And because there's a lack of information, and because we live in an era of pervasive disinformation, those of us who are advocates have a responsibility to point out that there are commonalities in our community and there are differences in our community, and that no one person represents the community overall. I say this because on some level, we all would love to have an easy, one-size-fits-all answer for discrimination and bigotry. Wouldn't that be amazing? If there were an easy playbook we could all read and have the answers, we wouldn't have to have this conference right now. We could just have the book and then learn it, and then we'd be set. And that's not the way it works. If you came here for all the answers to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm sorry to disappoint you. That just doesn't exist. If you think that being an ally to a marginalized community is difficult because it's unclear what you should be doing at any given moment, I sympathize with you, because I sometimes feel that same sense of frustration and confusion being an ally to certain communities. But I would ask you to try being a member of that marginalized community and understanding that no matter what you do, no matter what disagreements may take place, no matter what feelings may be hurt, you can't walk away from who you are. and nothing will get better unless you do the work. Marginalized people can't walk away from these challenges. We can't. We just live with them 24/7. You know, if I walk to the store, I don't stop being trans on my walk to the store. I am trans while I'm sleeping, trans when I'm awake, and I just remain a trans person. People who are not trans don't have to experience this 24/7 by definition, by logic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not a critique or a criticism. That's just how it is. That's reality. When a person who is not transgender, a cisgender person, walks to class, for example, on your campus, you know, they don't have to experience what it's like to be a trans person walking to class. Now apply that to every other aspect of life. And so we have to identify that in order to understand that not all of our experiences are commensurate. And that's why it's important to have a conversation like this, is to get to know what another person goes through, and how we can better understand their lived experiences to not only be a better ally, but just be a better friend, a better family member, a better community leader, a better teacher. You know, every aspect of public life really hinges on our ability to understand others. That brings me to my second disclaimer, and this is really important. Yes, I am a trans woman, which means that I do experience transphobia, misogyny, and homophobia in various forms, but I am also white. I am able-bodied. I am not a religious minority. I have access to quality healthcare. I have all of these things that provide me unearned privileges on my journey. All of us, I don't care who it is, all of us are a combination of privileges and oppressions. Some of us do have a lot more privileges than others, and some of us have a lot more oppressions. But it's important to note that experiencing a form of oppression does not erase the privileges we hold. So being an oppressed person in some ways does not absolve us of our responsibility to be an ally in other ways. I'm a trans woman, but I'm also white. So I have a personal responsibility to help dismantle and hold accountable white supremacy. I am a trans woman, but I'm not a religious minority. I'm a Christian. I go to church on Sundays. The Bible is, something that guides me in my personal journey. And as a Christian in this country, which is really dominated by Christian theology, I have a solemn obligation to stand beside those who are marginalized because of their religious beliefs, or those who have no religious beliefs at all. And the fact that makes them vulnerable to persecution. So that's really important. I'm a trans woman, but I am able-bodied. I do have certain disabilities that don't deal with my corporeal sense of self, but the world is constructed for me to navigate spaces with relative ease compared to those who use wheelchairs or walkers or are otherwise told so often the world doesn't need to accommodate them. So you get the picture. Believe it or not, every single one of us can take an inventory of the privileges and oppressions that we experience. And we realize that when we do that, the world is far more complicated when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion than we're led to believe. The straight, cisgender, white, male military veteran who struggles with PTSD may have a whole lot of unearned privileges because of his gender identity, his race, his sexual orientation, but he still struggles to move through the world with that PTSD, regardless of the oppressions of others. And we need to understand that, DEI really is for everyone. It breaks my heart when DEI is basically framed as how to be nice to women, people of color, and LGBTQ folks, because that is so often the way it's framed, and that nothing could be further from the case. It includes all of us. It includes all of humanity. DEI is for everyone, and I mean everyone. If you don't think that DEI somehow isn't intended to protect a person like you, I promise you're wrong about that. Because there are so many aspects of our lived experiences that don't have to do with race, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And we need to hold those accountable. and be accountable to other people, be accountable to ourselves, and make sure that we're being good stewards of what it means to include everybody, regardless of the oppressions and privileges they hold. Everyone who comes here in good faith is welcome here, and everyone benefits from DEI. And so that's one of the key things that I want you to walk away with tonight. There's one more thing that we need to get to before I launch into my own personal journey, because I realize that a lot of folks here may not be familiar with some of the terminology that I'll use tonight and the reasoning behind it. So the word transgender is somewhat confusing for folks who get more into this. And so I want to clarify that real quick. There's the academic definition. There is the way it's universally applied. And then there is the wider public perception of what it means to be transgender. And all three of these are kind of different from each other. And I want to make sure that we take stock of that. The academic definition of transgender is someone whose identity or gender expression is different from the cultural expectations that are based on the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, I'll get to the difference between identity and expression in a second. I promise it's not complicated. But that's the academic definition, right? This is meant to be an umbrella term. It's meant to include far more than just trans women and trans men, because so often the wider public really only sees transgender men and transgender women, and it's so much more complicated than that. There are so many identities that fall under what we call the transgender umbrella. That's why transgender is meant to be an umbrella term. So you have trans men, trans women, non-binary people, genderqueer people, gender non-conforming. You have drag queens, drag kings, folks who identify as cross-dressers. There are all sorts of identities that are entitled to use that word transgender as it applies to them. But somehow the way that that's been communicated in the mainstream is that only trans men and trans women are transgender, and that's not true. So I want to be clear about that. And in fact, what's really troubling is that so often transgender men in particular are kind of erased from this conversation. Their experiences are swept under the rug. Their battles with how to transition and evolve, or not evolve, but I suppose negotiate the evolution of the society around them is so often erased. And so we need to be very aware of that, excuse me, and make sure that we are being fully inclusive and understanding that the transgender community is quite diverse. It's full of different experiences, and that we're really recognizing all those different identities. And just an aside real quick, excuse me 1 second. Just an aside real quick. There's a reason that I keep saying the phrase trans and non-binary, because you might be wondering, wait, if non-binary people fall under the trans umbrella, doesn't that mean that the phrase trans non-binary is redundant? Now, many non-binary folks, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Many non-binary folks don't feel comfortable attaching themselves to any particular label that has a gendered connotation. So even the term non-binary can be uncomfortable on some level. So to respect that experience, what we do is we use the phrasing trans and non-binary. Non-binary people can certainly identify trans if they want, but some do not. And so we need to be respectful of that. So that's why I keep using that phrase. So what if you're not transgender? What if you identify with the cultural expectations of your gender based on your sex assigned at birth? That's the vast majority of people. That would mean that you're cisgender. That's the term that you use. Now that's often shorted to just cis, C-I-S. That prefix is Latin. It means on this side of, and it basically means that your gender has been static since birth. Sometimes you might hear the term cishet, which is C-I-S-H-E-T, cishet. That's short for cisgender and heterosexual. I want to note real quick that neither of these terms are derogatory. They're not insults. There is this really awful claim among anti-transgender people that calling someone cisgender is somehow an insult, and nothing could be further from the truth. That's simply false on every level. When we talk about gender identity, we're talking about everyone. And so, cisgender is literally just a way to differentiate between people who are trans non-binary and people whose gender aligns with their sex assigned at birth. And having that term cisgender makes it easier to differentiate between different identities. That's all that is. It's certainly not derogatory. So I want to put that out there real quick. Everyone identifies with some specific categorization of gender, or at the very least, they move through the world in a way that corresponds with a particular categorization, which really reflects how the world perceives them, right? So if someone looks at me, they might perceive me as a trans woman. I don't pass very well, clearly. And I'm okay with that. That's just the way it is. But someone sees me and they might categorize me as a trans woman. So regardless of whether or not I want to be identified as a trans woman, sometimes people will look at me and say, oh, that must be a trans woman. So we have labels for that reason. These labels give us a better sense of language to navigate the intricacies and nuances of how to talk about trans non-binary people, talk about cisgender people, talk about gender identity, talk about all these things within the realm of what it means to understand gender. We have a spectrum of gender expression. Now, I don't want to confuse you, and really this is a very simple concept. So gender identity is that label you use, right? Transgender, non-binary, cisgender, et cetera. Gender expression is how an individual expresses themselves to the world in terms of their presentation. So how you see me right now, this is an aspect of my gender expression. Everyone has a gender expression, and it's unique. It is infinitely complex. No two gender expressions are the same. It's almost like a fingerprint. It's unique to the individual. So we fall on that spectrum of gender expression, which is not always the most salient way of looking at it, but it's a good introduction to it. So say there's a continuous line, right? And over here, you have maybe the more masculine gender expressions, and over here, you have the more feminine gender expressions. We all fall on that continuum to some extent. There's no exact science to this, obviously. There's not a numerical value that we assign to someone's masculinity and femininity, because there's no way to objectively quantify someone's gender expression. And yet, we all have a general sense of how the wider public perceives gender. We do, all of us. In film and television, that is a common theme. Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec is seen as this avatar of modern masculinity, right? He is seen as a very masculine person, and we kind of all understand that based on the way he presents, or that character presents himself to the world. We know, for example, that Dolly Parton is quite feminine in presentation. She is high femme. She is very, very feminine. We know that John Wayne is quite masculine. We can logically say that Dolly Parton is magnitudes more feminine in her presentation than John Wayne was when he was alive. They fall on that gender spectrum. So although we can't necessarily quantify these things in an exact mathematical way, we can still have a sense of it, right? We still can kind of tell when we're looking at two different people, oh yeah, this person, in the way they're presenting to me right now, they seem a little more feminine, and this other person might seem a little more masculine. Everyone falls in that spectrum. No one here will be surprised when I say that this is a whole ongoing conversation among cisgender men who were assigned male at birth and of course identify as men. So many cisgender men constantly debate what it means to be manly in today's society. What they're really talking about is gender expression. Now, they may not know the term gender expression, but that's what they're talking about. They're talking about how their gender expressions are different from each other. There are jokes about so-called man cards that kind of serve as a currency of manliness. Now, is some of this just playful among friends? Sure, but it's a way of differentiating between different cisgender people, different cisgender men. And this includes everything. This is the clothes a person wears, it's the type of job they have, it's the words they use, their mannerisms, everything that shapes how a person's identity is perceived by the wider world shapes how their gender expression can be defined by others. All of it, everything. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're at your Thanksgiving table and you're talking to your grandfather and your uncle, I guarantee you that if you really explore it a lot, you can, really parse out what ways your grandfather might be a little more masculine than your uncle, or your uncle might be a little more masculine than your grandfather, because there are so many aspects that go into our personal identities that are gendered, that have a gendered connection. So that's what we mean by gender expression. So everyone has a gender identity. It's not just a trans thing. Everyone, regardless of who they are, has a gender identity. Everyone has a gender expression, and they are not the same thing. Specifically in terms of trans people, and this is important too, some trans women may very proudly identify as women, but just like cis women, some may not necessarily present in feminine ways most of the time, because there are cis women, women who identify, women assigned female at birth who identify as women, who may not really, present themselves in a feminine way. They might present more at times, masculine. It's the same way with trans people, same exact way. I happen to be a trans woman. Looking at that continuum, I'm over here with Dolly Parton. I am super feminine. I love being feminine. That's who I am. But not all trans women are like that. I have trans women friends who, have, spent most of their lives as women, presenting as women, I should say. But they may present in a more masculine manner in the same way as their cis women counterparts who present as masculine. So gender expression and gender identity, not the same thing. They can overlap, but they're two different components of a person. So just to be clear about that. Same way, by the way, with people who are non-binary. Folks who are non-binary have no shortage of gender expressions that they present to the world. Some days they may feel like presenting more feminine. Some days they may present more masculine. Some days kind of like a neat middle ground between the two. Just because someone is non-binary doesn't mean they have to choose a gender expression. That's kind of the whole point of identifying as non-binary, is that you are not allowed, but you identify with a greater fluidity in your gender expression than others do. So that's an important clarification, because a lot of people don't understand that about non-binary people. So the biggest takeaway for you on gender expression is this: it is infinitely diverse, but it's how you identify and move through the world. And although it may be framed as complicated, what is not so complicated is simply meeting people where they are and respecting who they choose to be. That costs you nothing. So if you're ever confused about someone's gender expression, or how to navigate these waters, just remember that the easiest thing to do is respect who they are. That's it. That's all it is. Just respect who they are. It is the easiest approach to any of this. One more thing, and I promise we'll move on. But I have to get all these ducks in a row for folks who may not know. Gender identity and sexual orientation are not the same thing. Two very separate concepts. Gender identity, we already talked about. Sexual orientation is your romantic and sexual interests in other people. It's how you form romantic and sexual connections. That's not the same thing as gender identity. And that's important to note, because so often it's assumed that trans women have a particular sexual orientation, and there's just no correlation between the two. So for example, a trans woman who is only attracted to people who identify as men is heterosexual, because she is a woman who is only attracted to men. Therefore, she is straight. She's a heterosexual. A trans man who is attracted only to men is a gay man. He is a man who is attracted only to men. Therefore, he is gay. So you can see that these two concepts they can maybe overlap sometimes, but in certain ways with a person's personal makeup, but they're really separate from each other. So just to be clear on that, two separate aspects of a person's identity. So now that I've given you a crash course in all the sexual and gender identity and gender expression terms, let's talk about me a little bit, because that's why I'm here. I'm supposed to be kind of giving you some insight into really what it means to be a trans person living in the post-Trump world, because it's scary. When I was growing up in Central Texas, I knew from an early age that something was off. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I just knew that I really wanted to be a girl. That doesn't mean that I wasn't into boy stuff. Like I liked football. I liked certain aspects of masculinity that appealed to me, but mostly I really wanted to be a girl. And that doesn't describe all trans people. We all have, our unique journeys in coming out and really aligning ourselves with the wider world. Some trans people don't really understand that about themselves until later in life. And that's okay. There's no right way to come out. There's no right way to understand yourself. Really, the most important thing is that people be given space to understand themselves. And so for me, growing up in Central Texas, it was a socially conservative environment. I didn't even know the word transgender all throughout childhood. I had no idea how to talk about gender. I had no idea how to talk to adults about this feeling inside myself that, wanted to wear dresses. I wanted breasts. I wanted a vagina. I really wanted a different body. I did not feel comfortable in the body I had been given at all. And, part of me thought maybe this is adolescence to some extent, because everyone who goes through adolescence feels a little bit of incongruency. It's a new thing. You're trying to figure out who you are, but that wasn't this. That wasn't this at all. I did everything I was supposed to do as a kid. I was pretty well behaved. I, got good grades. I didn't get into trouble much. I kind of towed the line. And part of that was really harmful, because I had this feeling in my mind that if I just keep listening to the adults in my life, if I do what I'm supposed to do, that this problem will go away, that my brain will somehow fix itself. So, even though I enjoyed football, part of me played football because I thought that maybe playing high school football would somehow cleanse this need from me to be a woman, to be a girl. And clearly that did not happen. In fact, although I enjoyed football quite a bit, it only reinforced those aspects of me that really desired to be feminine. And it was troubling. It was deeply troubling. I leaned more into religion for other reasons too. Like I do have a very strong personal faith system. I believe in God and I'm a Christian. But I would be lying if I said that a strong part of me wondered if maybe if I go to church more, somehow this need for me to be a woman will be removed from my soul. If I just pray constantly, I prayed, gosh, almost every day when I was a kid, that God would remove this part of me. And it never happened. It never happened. I graduated high school. I joined the military primarily to serve because I felt called to serve, but there was still a part of me that thought, if you go in the military and, you do what you need to do, that somehow your gender identity will write itself. And I didn't even know the word gender identity at that time, but I thought this is what will finally, prevent me from thinking along those lines of wanting to be a woman. And again, it just didn't work. I spent most of my life really focused on this very toxic and dangerous version of self-conversion therapy, really trying to train myself out of these thoughts. And nothing ever worked. The prayer didn't work. Serving in the military didn't work. Having, male friends in my life didn't work. Had nothing to do with my father, who I worshiped when I was a kid. I love my father, but it just didn't work. None of it. So, I got to the point finally in my early 20s where I realized that this problem wasn't going away. And there comes a point, I think, in your, the life of a trans non-binary person, and hopefully it happens really early, but there comes a point where you just can't take it anymore. And I couldn't take it. So I would say in my early 20s, I started identifying as non-binary, because to me, it almost felt like, okay, let me try this and see if this works. Because being non-binary, I felt, would give me a sense of liberation or freedom. So I don't have to choose yet. I can just figure this out. Most non-binary people are exactly that. Excuse me, let me get some tissues real quick. Most non-binary people identify as non-binary because they're non-binary. That's how they are. They don't identify as male or female. They are very firmly comfortable identifying as non-binary, genderqueer, or gender non-conforming. And that wasn't exactly me, but I felt like it was a way to explore my gender and figure things out. And I started coming out to friends slowly but surely. And then Trump got elected. And then I realized that, if I have to wait until after this monster is gone from office, I mean, goodness gracious, I don't think I can do that. I just couldn't. And so I finally came out. I came out in November 29th, 2017. After a lot of thought about it, talking with a lot of friends, talking with my reverend at my church, who is very pro LGBTQ. She's a lesbian, in fact, and she kind of walked me through some of the questions I had. So it was tough, but coming out was immediately a very strong sense of liberation. I finally felt right. One thing that really struck me when I came out is that in the weeks and months afterward, I kind of realized how depressed I had been. Sometimes when you're depressed, you don't realize how depressed you are. And when I was in the closet, I was really depressed. I was really angry. I had a lot of unresolved anger, and I didn't know how to express it. And so, I would present as male. I would, wear suits and present to the world as masculine. And I would sometimes get compliments on my appearance. People would say, "Oh, you're handsome." And it made my skin crawl. Even though I was conventionally attractive and, I was dating plenty of people, I had a fine, like my love life was fine. Nothing else was wrong, but I felt incredibly uncomfortable in my own skin. And I knew that problem was not going to go away. And so in the weeks and months afterward, when I came out, I realized just how lovely it was. This incredible sense of freedom to be myself, to, present to the world how I want it, finally. And you really can't put a price on that. You can't. I would choose this every single time. This is so much more superior to the life I was living when I was in the closet. It's not even close. It's night and day. And so many trans non-binary people go through that when they're in the closet. They struggle to be who they are. They have to hide themselves. They have to work around friends and family who are perhaps not so I would say friendly to LGBTQ people, and it's hurtful. It's very hurtful. When I came out, I started working for the Human Rights Campaign as their press secretary for rapid response. And this was right when Trump was really kind of ramping up his anti-LGBTQ policies. We live in a weird time right now, and Trump has encapsulated that. We live in an era of pervasive disinformation. And it's not just our elections, which is bad enough. It's not just the way that a lie on social media can travel incredibly quickly. It's how especially marginalized communities and our struggles are framed in the public discourse. Because disinformation is so, I would say, widely acceptable and condoned, trans people, the myths about us are horrendous. Some of the posts that I see on Facebook and Twitter are just complete outright lies, but they travel so quickly. And it's really hard to push back against that. I'll give you an example. So, in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, right? So people of all genders and sexes could, marry whoever they wanted. And then last year, the Supreme Court said that anti-LGBTQ discrimination in the workplace would be banned. So it is unlawful, right? Those are the only two federal protections that LGBTQ people have. That's it. That's it. And the much wider pie of this is so much bigger. Most forms of LGBTQ discrimination are still condoned. And that's because at the state level, there are anti-LGBTQ laws in the books, or there are no LGBTQ anti-discrimination policies in place. And that's most states. That's my home state of Texas. That's Missouri, where Webster University is. I love Missouri. It's a beautiful state. Amazing people come from Missouri. Jason Kander, Congresswoman Cori Bush. So many great leaders. But it is one of those states where there are still so many areas of public life that are closed off to LGBTQ people, and more specifically, trans people. So in Missouri, and in most of the United States right now, LGBTQ people, and more specifically trans people, still face discrimination in housing, credit, public accommodations, jury service, all these aspects of public life. So as a trans woman, if I were living in Missouri right now, it would be illegal to discriminate against me in the workplace, but it would not necessarily be illegal to deny me housing specifically because I'm a trans woman. There are no legal protections. And that's in most of the United States. If I drive from Florida to Oregon right now, I will pass through much of the country that does not extend to me equal rights. That goes for the vast majority of LGBTQ people in this country. It's interesting. A couple of years ago, I was discriminated against at a restaurant here in DC. And fortunately, it turned out to be okay. Well, it had a happy ending, I should say. That we had laws in the books in our the DC legal system that protected LGBTQ people. We had certainly LGBTQ people in the mayor's office and the police department who clearly adjudicated this very quickly. But that's not the case for most trans people in the United States. And even in places like DC, which are very progressive, trans people still face discrimination in certain ways that are kind of outside the bounds of the law. That's why I really hate this expression of red states and blue states when it comes to LGBTQ equality. Believe it or not, most LGBTQ people live in the South and the Midwest. They don't live on the East and West Coast. There are a lot of LGBTQ people who are on the East Coast and the West Coast, but most LGBTQ people live in places like Missouri and Central Texas and Mississippi and Georgia and Florida, places that are often more conservative in nature. And they have friends and family, and in many ways they thrive, but also in many ways they don't have those legal protections. And yet, even LGBTQ people who live in cities like New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago and DC, they often will lack a certain level of protection because they're transgender or because they're LGBTQ generally. And so we really need to get rid of this very toxic paradigm of red states and blue states, because blue states don't have it all figured out. And red states, quote unquote, red states hold most LGBTQ people in our country. And the more that we really reinforce that paradigm, the more we are simplifying the conversation to a point that is quite destructive. And it doesn't really help anyone. It's not helpful. So get rid of that completely. The problems facing someone in Missouri, an LGBTQ person in Missouri, may not be the exact same as someone facing them in DC, but they're both facing problems. They're both facing problems. So we need to address that. Part of the thing too right now are the massive efforts being made against transgender children. There are an estimated 300,000 trans non-binary children in our school systems today. And there are numerous states right now that are trying to push through pieces of legislation that specifically discriminate against trans non-binary children, specifically in sports. And it is fear-mongering, it is outright disinformation, it is a claim on science that does not exist. Everyone from the American Medical Association to the American Psychological Association to the American Psychiatric Association to the College of Pediatrics to the World Health Organization, all of these medical experts are in agreement with each other that trans non-binary people are real, they are valid, and they should be affirmed. All these medical experts. And so the science is clearly in support of trans non-binary people. But we have legislatures all throughout the country right now who are conservative and who are attacking trans children solely because it is beneficial to their political careers. That is disgusting, it is wrong, and it needs to be held accountable. So I really want folks to keep that in mind. There is a lot of disinformation right now about trans people. And the way to fight back against that is doing things like this, having these kind of conversations, going to DEI conferences, reading books about trans people, researching in your own time the myths and the propaganda that has been leveled against trans non-binary people. It's not good, but we can fight it and we can defeat it, and we can build a world that is really more inclusive of all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. But it's going to take some labor from all of us. It's going to take each of us really digging deep and deciding that it is far more important to do the labor and taking care of our friends and our loved ones and our neighbors than simply ignoring it because it's too hard and too complex and too uncomfortable to understand. Every single anti-trans argument can be boiled down to this essence, that even though that person may not know the science, even though their arguments are clearly wrong, at the root of it is simply being uncomfortable with the reality of trans non-binary people existing. Trans non-binary people have always existed, always. I mean, quite literally, we have always existed. For as long as there has been recorded human history, trans non-binary people can be found in every country, every race, every ethnicity, every nationality, every culture, every religion, from Iran to Australia to South America to Russia. Trans non-binary people are found all throughout the world, everywhere. Native American tribes here in the United States have two-spirit people. There are communities in India in which people don't identify as male or female or really with any gender. They're almost agender. This is something that is not a quality of any particular region or culture. It's pervasive. And the sooner we accept that, the sooner we realize that trans non-binary people have been as integral to the fabric of humanity as anyone else, the sooner we'll get to a place where we accept it as part of just what it means to be human. So, I'm kind of going over time right now, and I apologize for that. I have so much to say. Obviously, this is a much longer conversation that needs to be had. But what I will tell you is that, really what I would ask is that folks do more to research these issues in their own time, that they really take on the labor of educating themselves and others about LGBTQ people generally, but more specifically trans people, and more specifically than that, trans and non-binary people of color. Trans non-binary people of color are far more oppressed than any other demographic. There is an ongoing epidemic of anti-trans violence. At least 44 trans people were killed last year. Trans and non-binary people were killed last year, and the vast majority of them were Black and brown women. This is something that really intersects with white supremacy in such a dangerous and incredibly violent way. And so it's really important that we center the outlook and struggles of people of color within the LGBTQ movement, and more specifically among trans non-binary people when we have these conversations. So again, I am way over time, so I apologize, but thank you so much for this conversation, Webster. It has been an honor to speak to you tonight, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. I am more than happy to chat with you further about all these topics, and more specifically about trans non-binary people. Thank you so much.
Charlotte, thank you. Thank you for, first of all, your graciousness. You were incredibly gracious as we worked through those glitches there. I really, truly appreciate that. But more importantly, thank you for your presence and for joining us here at the conference. Your story and sharing your personal story has left me with goosebumps. I've had a couple of folks text me as well saying the same. So thank you. It is our plan to move into Q&A, and there are many questions here. But after the Q&A, for those of you who are available and able to stick around, we will give this old technology one more good old try here.
Stay with us, stay with us.
Stay with us to watch, because I do think it's fantastic and critically important that you all see what we call our Champions for All Award recipients. And that would be Mary Ella Jones of Ferguson, the first elected female and Black of Ferguson, Missouri, and Valerie E. Patton. And so please stick around if you're able to watch that tribute to them. It is proudly presented by Armstrong Teasdale. Thank you. Charlotte, first question. You make a great point about DEI being for everybody. Do you have any advice for convincing people who believe DEI somehow takes away from their experiences of the fact?
So what I really encourage any kind of DEI training, and unfortunately the vast majority of DEI people already do this, is asking folks to take an inventory of what they go through, their oppressions and their privileges. And even folks with a lot of privilege, a lot of privilege that they can't help. You can't fix privilege. It's just something you have. And so even folks like who are white male cisgender men, they have certain oppressions that they experience, but they don't know it yet. And DEI is created specifically to address those oppressions. And so it's really important that we kind of take a whole view of the person. And how we interact with each other when we're talking about DEI, because it goes far beyond just a few characteristics. It's really about all of us and what it means to go into our whole beings.
Thank you. Here's another one. How do you think trans topics should be worked into pre-K through 12 education? Or do you think it should be at all?
I do. I absolutely do. There are countless children who from an early age explore their gender in a way that is not necessarily the norm or what we would expect of early childhood education. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're trans non-binary. Some kids who are cisgender just like to, explore different other aspects of gender. There are boys who like to wear dresses and girls who might be into more masculine things. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that they're trans non-binary people. In fact, statistically, they're definitely not trans non-binary based on the statistics, but you still need to provide a path for them to explore gender and get to a place where they not only respect their own identity, but respect the identity of those around them. This is something we need to introduce very early in childhood education to ensure that people are telling their children that it's okay for people to be different, that we can respect those differences and ensure that we are culturally competent and we're giving a seat to everyone in the community.
Here's another one that's kind of a follow-up to that. I would love some help when speaking with my child. I want them to understand and not be afraid to ask questions. If we are out and my child sees something aloud, if we are out and my child says something aloud that could be miscommunicated as negative, but it really is just a curious child asking a question. We are an asking anything family to make sure to be clear up any misconceptions and learn as we go and grow.
That is the best kind of learning environment. When kids are encouraged to ask questions about the world around them, and learn that, we all kind of have some unlearning to do and some relearning to do. There have been kids who walked up to me and in pure curiosity said, "Are you a man or are you a woman?" Because they didn't know. Because they're kids. They have no idea. They don't know how to process this. And that's a really great opportunity. It's a good opportunity to talk about gender and really ask questions of the kid, like, well, what are you into? Like, what kind of things do you like? What do you think about the fact that mommy identifies as a woman and daddy's a man? Or whatever the family situation happens to be. That's a great gateway to having bigger conversations on respect for others, and really letting a kid lead the conversation and their curiosity. I prize those moments. In fact, I would encourage it.
What do you see for the future of trans people in the military?
The U.S. military is the largest employer of trans people in the world. There are, and it's not just the estimated 15,000 trans people currently serving in the military. It's also trans people who work in the civilian ranks within the Department of Defense. Fortunately, we have a President Biden, and a Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin, and of course, Vice President Harris, who have all made it quite clear that they are fully in support of trans and non-binary people serving openly in the military. President Biden did issue an executive action last month that overturns the ridiculous, nonsensical ban on trans people in the military, but it's going to take a couple months for that to go into effect. And that's what always happens with the military, by the way. If you create a new uniform for a branch of service, like say the Army starts, wearing the new uniform, it takes a couple years for it to fully go into rotation. So every policy in the military is just debated to death, and then it has to be put into the process of being implemented. And so what I would tell people is that you're not going to immediately see this put into place in all the ways we would like, but that's the military. It's complicated. The process is really done in a way that is supposed to protect people in a regulatory manner. And it's actually good for trans people. I would personally say, because those few months are dedicated to retraining our service members, to educating them on trans topics, to ensuring that leaders understand how to, I would say, ensure a proper and professional environment for trans non-binary people under them. So it's a good thing that the military is kind of taking their time to properly implement this policy.
You mentioned, I can't let this one go by without acknowledging the fact that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is a Webster University graduate.
Really? I had no idea.
Yes.
I'll be damned.
Yes.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So
I love him. He's fantastic. Secretary Austin is just a wonderful professional. I haven't personally met him, but I have so many friends who work for him. In fact, one of my good friends is now his personal DEI consultant. And every review I've gotten is that he is a true leader who makes sure that no one gets left behind. So that is part of Webster's education, is preparing people for the wider world.
It is indeed, it is. When the opportunity presents itself, please send greetings from Webster to him through your friend. We'd love that. How have the Trump administration and associate ideologies altered the way marginalized people have to move through the world? What can these groups do to keep themselves safe?
Well, I'm going to flip the question for a second. I don't think it's the responsibility of vulnerable communities to keep themselves safe. I think it is the responsibility of those of us who are allies to ensure that we're doing the work to stand beside marginalized communities and fight for their safety and inclusion, and that they are full members of society with equal rights in every way. The Black Lives Matter movement has been a long time coming accountability of systemic racism in this country. The last year with all the protests over the death of George Floyd and numerous other innocent people by law enforcement, it really has brought to bear a very uncomfortable conversation that we need to have. And part of that is making sure that as allies, particularly for those of us who are white, that we're doing the labor of listening to folks who have these lived experiences, to make sure that we are showing up, and to make sure that we're being good supportive actors here, that we are doing what the labor that is necessary to kind of push us to a better place for all people, regardless of race or ethnicity.
That's awesome. Do you have any advice for allies wishing to help trans companions through their transition?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, ensuring that you're asking questions in a way that's respectful. This always starts with good conversations, right? Every relationship in which there's a cisgender person and a trans person, those are really guided successfully by heartfelt conversations on how each other is feeling. It's the same as any relationship in some ways, because in any relationship, you have two different world experiences that are coming together and trying to align. And there might be a lot of similarities, thus it's a relationship, but there are a lot of differences too. And so the best thing you can do as a companion to a trans person is be a good listener and constantly create opportunities where you can talk about the discomfort both of you are feeling and reconcile it against each other's experiences. That's the best way to go about that.
Thank you. This one's a little bit long here. My cousin is a trans man. I worry about him as most of our relatives do not understand or support him. While his sister and mother both support him, I know his mother, at least, has struggled with losing her daughter too. Given all the personal questioning that you did, and most people do, trans or not, and then all the family considerations, what would you encourage families and friends to do to support youth in whatever they may be facing?
That is a fantastic question. And there's a lot to unpack there. And so I'll try to be concise in my answer. It is very common in families for there to be a sense of mourning when someone comes out as transgender. And it's not derogatory. It's not a sense of, not respecting who that person is. Mostly it's just a very flawed perception of what it means to be transgender. And 9 times out of 10, a family member who is mourning, so to speak, is really under the impression that a trans or non-binary person is not going to be able to do certain things in life. And that is never true. That is just not the case. And so the way you get past that is having conversations with folks who are uncomfortable with the concept and kind of walking them through their concerns. And as a family member who's an ally, that really is your responsibility, is to reach out to those folks and kind of broach the subject like, hey, why are you uncomfortable with this? What does it mean to you to see your kid or your relative go through this process? And then to kind of address their points one by one. A lot of parents of trans kids somehow think that their kids are going to have kids, that they can't have grandkids, and that's not the case. That doesn't happen. Trans people have kids. Trans people, go into all sorts of careers. A variety of careers that are commensurate with their cisgender peers. The only barriers against trans people are really the legal ones that are so pervasive right now at the state level, and we're going to get rid of those in good time. And so if you are the parent of a trans kid or the relative of a trans kid, what I would say is, I promise you, it is not even a fraction as bad as you've been led to believe. Not even close. You just got to do the work in understanding what it means to be transgender so it can kind of comfort you and you can realize, oh, this is completely different from what I thought. So you'll get there.
So this one is a greeting first, hello. And then they go on to say, I am a trans man in the Air Force. I've somehow survived the trans ban, but have been given the label medical defect. Still, I'm only remaining with a medical waiver. Do you have advice on confronting decision makers, as this label is wrong and harmful for me, as well as other trans people attempting to join or remain in the military? In hopes of also creating a teaching moment for allies.
Absolutely, yes. Well, first of all, that is horrible that it's on your record, and that should not be. For 3 years before Trump's ban went into place, trans people were serving openly, honorably, and proudly. And every 4-star general who oversaw the various branches of the military, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, et cetera, they testified before the Senate, and each of them said there had been 0 issues with trans non-binary people serving openly in the military. And so, we're going to get to a point where we address these more particular ways of how records are kept, of how people are perceived on their records. What I will say is that, that policy process is taking shape very quickly, lightning speed in the military's terms, because to the person who asked this question, I'm sure you know that the military is just notoriously slow in policy implementation. Doesn't matter what it is. It could be changing pencils to use, and it'll take 5 months to get it done. They're going lightning fast with this. I mean, it is quick. And so I will say that in the very near future, we're going to get to a more equitable place where trans non-binary people are not unnecessarily outed or told that they're somehow medically defect, because that is certainly not true by any medical definition. Just be patient. It's going to take some time, but we're going to get there.
You mentioned that it is not necessarily a bad thing to use language to depict race, gender, and sexuality that you see. However, don't you think that the key to eliminating bigotry is to achieve a society in which those kinds of distinctions are not even thought of?
Absolutely. My goodness, I would love a society in which labels didn't exist. Wouldn't it be great if we could all walk outside our door and just be who we are? That would be amazing. But we're not there yet. And part of getting there is having these kind of conversations. And to have that kind of conversation, you need language. You need to be able to differentiate between different experiences. For example, when I was explaining what the word cisgender means and its importance to this kind of discourse, we couldn't have conversations on gender identity if we weren't able to differentiate between people. You can't talk about bigotry or discrimination without having those kind of languages, having that kind of language and those kind of terms. So it's going to take a while to get there. It's going to take a long time, but we're on the path. If you had asked someone a century ago, why we refer to, certain people in certain groups with certain terms, it would probably be the same answer. But we don't use the same terminology we did 100 years ago. And there's a good reason for that, because we've evolved past that, because we've had those uncomfortable conversations and the policy answers, and we've gotten to a place where that is no longer necessary. And that's what I hope for really everyone in generally, is that we don't have to use labels far off into the future.
Here's a comment for you. You have achieved so very much since November 29, 2017. It is so amazing. Thanks for your contribution to your endeavor.
Thank you. Whoever wrote that, I am. That's very sweet. Thank you. That means a lot to me.
There's one of our final 2 questions here for you.
Okay.
Common sources of information often tell a specific narrative. What are the best ways, in your opinion, to find information to explore unique perspectives on these topics to get a better view of the overall picture? So
media literacy is very complicated. I find that some people will go to a website that, to me, it's obvious that it's not a reputable news website, but they'll see it and they'll think that it's a reputable news website because it has that look, that general look of what, a CNN or an MSNBC or a New York Times is supposed to look like. And it's often not. And part of that struggle is kind of going through the process of trial and error, really doing the labor of researching what news sources are reputable. And it doesn't mean liberal conservative, because there are more conservative outlets who I may not always agree with, but they are reputable. For example, the Wall Street Journal is a conservative outlet, and they've done some amazing reporting on things, and they are conservative. But they are not something like Breitbart, for example, Breitbart.com, that is a disreputable news source. And it's not because they're conservative, it's because they outright lie and fabricate on things. And so you're going to get to that point where you understand better news sources that are reputable and ones that are not reputable, but it takes time and it takes interrogating how these websites operate, the kind of disinformation they put out. A good way to do this, perhaps, is to take 2 or 3 articles and kind of read through them, underline all the factual statements, and then go look them up yourself. And then if you realize that, oh, wow, there are like at least 3 or 4 clear inaccuracies here that are clearly stated as truth, that is probably a disreputable source and you shouldn't be using it.
And assuming then that you're also sourcing it against a reputable source.
That's right.
Right, because you can find that message still being delivered in other sources as well.
That's absolutely right.
You mentioned the lack of protections federally, but on a smaller scale, what can be done at the community level to encourage trans inclusion?
Oh, I love that question. That is a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that, because I wish I had gone into this more. All politics is local. That's the famous saying by former speaker Tip O'Neill. And it is completely, absolutely 100% true. All politics is local. The best change you can do is by lobbying your local government and your state government to put policies in place that protect trans non-binary people. There are towns and cities in, I would say, more conservative leaning states that have put progressive policies in place that protect trans non-binary people, even though the state overall doesn't protect them. You would be shocked. In fact, well, some of you wouldn't, but I think a large portion of people watching right now would be shocked by how much you can do just by putting forth some effort in your local government. There are so many school board seats that people never run for, or that people run unopposed for. There are city council meetings that no one attends. There are so many mechanisms and levers of local and state government that are ignored because people are so focused on Congress and what the federal government does. But you can create a lot of positive change for vulnerable communities, not just trans non-binary people, but women, BIPOC folks, people of color, essentially, disabled people, religious minorities. Across the board, there are things you can do at the local and state level that are much, much, much easier to do than going through the process of the federal government. So my advice is to really get involved. Research the local offices that are held near you. If you don't want to run for them, start talking to those elected officials and letting them know what's important to you. They're very accessible. I promise you they're accessible. We kind of perceive, like a city council, even a city council person, we kind of perceive them as being separate from us. I promise you, email your office and ask to meet with someone on the staff there, and I guarantee you they'll meet with you and they'll be open to your concerns. And if you don't like what you're hearing, run against them. Run for that office on a platform of changing how things are done. So many people have done that, and they've created an enormous change going through that process.
Charlotte, I can't thank you enough. You have certainly elevated the conversations in our conference itself as well. Your presence, your words, your thoughts, your insights have been tremendously appreciated tonight. I'm so grateful. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Vincent. I just want to thank you for organizing this. You folks have just been fantastic. And I was so sad to see the glitch, because I thought, oh my God, they're not going to see all the work that went into this that I got to see, because we actually had a technical rehearsal for all this and everything went fine. And then for some reason, it just happens. But I cannot thank you enough for all the work you put into this conference.
Well, thank you. In regards to that technical glitch, we received a message from someone who said it just happens in this day and age, but the fortunate thing is that we are all together to learn. So thank you for providing that and for leading us through our learning tonight. Again, for those of you who are able to stick around, as Charlotte said, we would love for you all to watch the wonderful video that we've produced honoring our 2 award recipients. For those of you who are unable to stay, we certainly understand. We wish you well tonight. And we hope that you all will join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time as we begin day 2 of our program. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.